Good afternoon, dear participants and dear panelists. Let us move now on with our discussion on teachers in higher education. When we encouraged discussions on teachers under the Croatia's presidency, it became clear that everybody immediately thinks of teachers as lower level of education teachers. It is probably because the topic of teacher development in higher education is considered to be an exclusive competence of autonomous higher education institutions. Nevertheless, there is certainly a potential, and I would say even a responsibility for the governments and European level institutions to support the developments of this policy area further. Since 2009 and the Leuven Communiqué, ministers of the European higher education area have noted the importance of learning and teaching in higher education in a number of communiques within the Bologna process. And most recently in 2019, in the Paris Communiqué, the ministers agreed to support institutions in continuous enhancement of teaching and learning across European higher education area. And they also asked for teaching to be one of the bases of academic career progression, in addition to research and contribution to society. That was at the level of Bologna process with the 48 countries of European higher education area. And at the level of European Union, improving teaching quality and interaction between research and teaching was identified as one of the action areas in the 2017 renewed EU agenda for higher education. And this inspired many projects. And with the completion of the EFFECT project, the European principles for teaching and learning have been developed. And also policy recommendations have been taken up by the BFUG Advisory Group for Teaching and Learning. When it comes to Croatia's presidency and the focus on teachers, the focus and the scope of this conference is to build on the Council conclusions on the European teachers and trainers for the future, and also on the Council conclusions on the countering the COVID-19 crisis in education and training, both adopted during Croatia's presidency. And this panel will present an opportunity to further explore the challenges faced by the teachers in higher education, as well as possible policy responses in this respect. We have 4 panelists that will launch the debate, introducing the topic from their different perspectives. So here is Michael Gaebel from European University Association, Terry Maguire from the Irish National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, Ulf-Daniel Ehlers from the Baden-Württemberg Cooperative State University, Karlsruhe, and he's here on behalf of the BFUG Advisory Group on Learning and Teaching, and representing the students, Gohar Hovhannisyan. Sorry, Gohar, for misspelling your name. And I'm Anna Tecilazić Goršić, coming from the Croatian Ministry of Science and Education, and I will be the moderator of this session. And participants are invited to send their comments and questions in writing by using questions and answers function, and we will try to address at least some of them during our session. So firstly, I would like to invite Michael Gaebel to present his view on the key outcomes of the EFFECT project, including the most important messages from the European principles for the enhancement of learning and teaching, and recently published feasibility study promoting European dimension to teaching enhancement, as well as most important findings in relation to the COVID-19 impact on higher education. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Anna. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. And good afternoon, everybody. It feels, speaking about the effect in this panel, feels a bit like a home run because Terry, the National Forum, has been involved in it, and Ulf has also been in, and the European Student Union. But for those who don't know about it, the EFFECT has been probably the first step of the European University Association into learning and teaching. So this was in 2015. And as Anna just said, we had talked already a lot about learning and teaching in the framework of the Bologna process, but we also always took it as something that happens at the higher education institution without asking into too much detail how it is actually happening. And part of it is also that we talked about teaching and about students, but never actually about the teachers. And this we tried to change with when we started the effect, we tried to explore actually what it would take to support teachers and teaching through a European structure for teaching enhancement or pedagogical staff development, if you want so. And actually, when we started it, we had workshops and focus groups, and we realized very soon that this is not only just about pedagogics, but that it needs an institutional framework to make this happen and to make it really successful. To give you an example, when your entire higher education institution is focused on research, then also the academic careers focus on research. And then you can try whatever you want to do in pedagogical staff enhancement. It might not really fly. It might not really be taken up. And therefore, we concluded that it takes, in addition to pedagogical enhancement and staff training, it also takes an institutional approach to support learning and teaching. And that has to involve the leadership and all the members of the higher education institutions. So teachers, students, but also the staff that is not immediately teaching or has teaching responsibilities. And when we discussed this with colleagues from different countries, we found out that we were always talking about the same things. I mean, there was not so much difference. There was actually a lot of commonality, but because we used different terminology and also approached it from different perspectives, it always took a long time to get through these things. And this is how the 10 principles for the enhancement of learning and teaching then came into existence. We sat down one day or several days, structured it, discussed it, and brought it into a language which we thought could be easily understandable across Europe. And some of the principles, when you read them, they sound a little bit EBC. So there's emphasis made on student-centered learning, and that sounds very simple. But actually, we provided, together with the principles, a set of questions which allowed institutions to review actually what they do. So it's easy to say, yes, of course, we commit to student-centered learning, but then the question, how do you do that? And how do you actually know that this works? And then you start to have an interesting discussion. How do you define student-centered learning? And just to highlight a couple of other principles, for example, we called in the principles for an active participation and partnership of all the members of the higher education institution and to facilitate communication and collaboration among them, and also highlighted in particular the role of the institutional leadership. This was also at a period of time when the role of vice rectors for learning and teaching changed. They became a much more, I would say, strategic role in the institution. They had to develop not only to administer learning and teaching, but also to develop a strategic approach of the institution. And so these kind of questions, when you could simply ask then, what does your rector do for learning and teaching? Does he actually ever speak about learning and teaching? So we found out that most rectors actually prefer to speak about research. That's a much safer ground for them. Also probably because they may not feel very comfortable to speak about learning and teaching. So these were the kind of issues which we highlighted there, including also the recognition of teaching as a professional activity, because we found that staff, university, academics are often judged almost exclusively on their research, but not on their merits in teaching. And I think before you don't change that, it's very difficult then to get acceptance and buy-in into any kind of pedagogical development that you may launch, be it at national or at institutional level. Last point, probably, as you talked also about the European collaboration, we found it important that this exchange and collaboration on learning and teaching is not only inside a higher education institution, but that this is also happening outside. And we looked at different models in different countries at that time. And this is also how we learned about the UK Higher Education Academy, how we met the National Forum in Ireland. So different models on how to facilitate this exchange among practitioners and among institutional leadership and build community around this. And this is what we see still as an important, as a very important means to enhance the quality of learning and teaching. Probably I take it, well, last point maybe, we have seen all these principles, and I can send you the link in a minute. We have seen them actually confirmed now with the pandemic, because there was a huge quest for institutional leadership on, you needed an organizational approach to decide on how to deal with the pandemic that had to be communicated. Individual teachers have been clearly the heroes in this process, but it would have been very difficult for them to do that without any institutional approach. So I think that just confirms the point that that we made. And we saw that also in the huge interest that we saw in the sector. And despite the fact that so many colleagues were busy and had much more work to take up and to deal with than normally, but we saw that whenever we called for a meeting, for a workshop, for a webinar, we had lots of interest there. Colleagues were interested to exchange, to hear from each other, what were their experience, what they could learn from each other. And I think this is what we have to promote, not only in the times of crisis, but also in the times of non-crisis. So much for me as an introduction here, and I send you some links.
Thank you, Michael. And now it's a good time to ask Terry to take the floor, because obviously the Irish National Forum for the Enhancement of Teaching and Learning in Higher Education is very often invited to share its good practice on taking a national approach to enhancement of teaching and learning. And obviously this was the case for the EFEC project. So please tell us about your key to success.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Anna. I'm delighted to be here. If I'm talking, I suppose, about what working at a national level enables us to do, and we were in position before the crisis, which I think was quite good, is that we were able to effect change that you can't be done by individual institutions on their own. So, for example, we've set up a national framework for professional development for all those who teach. But at a national level, we generated conversations about what that would mean. We took into account and listened to the voices of different institutional types. We listened to different teachers, librarians who consider themselves as under the influence of those who teach because of their work now in information literacy, and technicians in the lab. So we were able to have those kind of national conversations and get that understanding that I don't think you can get within an institution on its own. Another thing, perhaps, which was done very much in partnership with our students, was to try and develop an understanding of student success. So what does student success mean? And nationally, we've changed the rhetoric around retention and sort of just hanging on to your students. It doesn't matter whether they're happy or not, that doesn't matter, to actually add a concept of student success, where student success is institutions working to help each individual student to their own view or definition of student success. And this has only been possible, I think, because it's been driven at a national level. But I think the way that we do it and the way that we're perceived and we're accepted by the sector is actually as a result of the way that we work. So we see ourselves informing and being informed by policy. We see ourselves working with the sector for the sector. All our work is based on consultation, on collaboration. We've got advisory groups, steering groups, representative groups, partnership agreements, and we consult broadly with the sector. So we build ownership of whatever's happening. So by the time we come out with a framework or we come up with an understanding, the sector has owned it because it feels it has really contributed to the development. We're also inclusive. So there's of all institutional types, whether it's a public university, an institute of technology, a private college. We're inclusive of all institutional types. And the other thing, I suppose, is we take an evidence-based approach, and that evidence is from both research and from practice. We also want to know what works, but we also want to know why it works. So we have a focus on impact, and this looks at how we make an impact, but also what lessons can be learned from that, as much as it's associated about being accountable. If you want academic ownership, you must have academic leadership. And I think one of the strengths of the forum is that it is strategically directed by an academically led board, but they're not on their own. With them, we have students, we have representatives from our national quality body, representatives from our policymakers, our business, representative from our institutional associations, and together they work in shaping the strategic focus of teaching and learning enhancement through the forum. And I think that's very strong. And I think, I suppose, like today, I mean, how much I learned an awful lot from working on the EFFECT project. We've learned a lot sharing today and listening to the conversations, listening from others' experiences internationally. Sometimes we think we're the only ones that have ideas, but I think sharing that, especially across borders with very different perspectives, is very useful. And I suppose the key thing is the ethos of the forum, is that we believe in people. And we believe that the potential to enhance teaching and learning exists in our higher education sector. And our job is to respect it, to nurture it, and to support it, not to dictate to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. These are very inspiring words for the end of your introductory speech. And I suppose it is quite challenging to take it at the European level, some good examples that have been created at the national level. So I would like to invite Ulf-Daniel Ehlers to introduce us to the outcomes of the work of the BFUG Advisory Group on Learning and Teaching that tried exactly to do that. Ulf, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anna. I hope that my voice is coming across loud and clear. When this task force or this advisory group was set out to start, we could already build on very, very good practices. For example, on the EFFECT project, which we've carefully studied, and also on national examples, like the initiative Terry was now just presenting. But what I think is important is that we took an angle to, in the very beginning of our work, when we sat down with 15 ministries of higher education and education across Europe, one year ago, more or less 1 year ago, that we set out and that we discussed, first of all, what is actually the challenge? And of course, there are many, many challenges around higher education, around Europe, on the national level. But two things were always guiding and be like a compass to our discussion. And that was the issue of digital transformation, which came very, very important. And we were seeing that if we talk about digital transformation, we do not talk about technical innovation. We are really talking about a new culture of learning. And then when realizing that, we were very much surprised that conversations around this new culture of learning are actually very, very well able to draw on the issues which the EFFECT study raised, which are supporting teachers' competencies, which are creating an institutional collaborative approach, forming teams, looking at institutional transformation, and dragging teachers out of an isolated role of an innovator into an alliance, an institutional and then inter-institutional alliance to bring organizations, to bring institutions forward. So that was very, very much our aim, to really understand the effects of these mega trends behind that. Another one, which is now very, very much also like digital transformation, made clear actually and emphasized through the Corona situation in which we are, is the issue which later we phrased as future skills, new skills. We were seeing very much that how societies and how Europe is developing cannot be any longer understood by analyzing the past, but that we have to deal a lot with emerging situations, which are emerging without notification, so to speak, without pre-advanced information, and with which graduates of the future will have to deal with in our societies and shape them. So that was an issue which we also discussed at length even before Corona already, and where we thought higher education institutions especially need to be able to deal with these issues and to deal with the question, how can we prepare students for things which we cannot prepare them for because we don't know them? So how can we make them ready to meet the future challenges by developing future skills? And what are these future skills? And again, we were seeing very much what has been presented and mentioned before, that we need a pedagogical approach for that. Because what is also clear is that we do not need to invent a new pedagogy, but that we really need to apply the pedagogy of projects, of problems, of passion, of creativity to our higher education institutions, which are today in a state in which they are largely focused on research-oriented values within their organizational culture and not on innovation, pedagogy, creativity for the future. So this is very much a pointed introduction into what led our discussions, which was important to understand the discussions and the results which we then had. And we were setting out to see which stakeholders do we need to address in the recommendations which we are going to make as a Bologna follow-up process advisor. We were very much clear on focusing on three different, let's say, trajectories of action. One was a very, very important one is to focus on students and to really make student-centered learning in its entire frame of inclusivity, valuing diversity and integrating all students from the angles where they are and from the positions into an inclusive learning process according to their needs and according to their abilities, making student-centered learning in that way a reality. And we know that we are talking about an old concept which has been long introduced already, and we realized that we are still talking about this concept and that we need to make efforts to reinforce that on a European level. The second trajectory of activities which our recommendations are focusing on is teachers capacity, teachers support, as it has been said before, to build frameworks in which teachers are supported on a level of their institutional support. So bringing into institutions activities and actions which are making teaching, innovation in teaching and modern use of teaching methodologies of pedagogical professionalization a value in our higher education institutions, which carries the same esteem like research does today. So, and then also to form national frameworks in which teachers are involved and can involve themselves and get support for their teaching abilities. And that, of course, not only has to do with digital tools, with digital transformation. Today, in Corona times, when we had to move online from one day to the other, this is, of course, a strong focus. But we can see that specifically now, it is not working to transfer our presential pedagogy online one by one, but that we really need a different pedagogy, that we need a professionalization process here. And the third trajectory of recommendations of focus, which we are focused on in our recommendations, is the institution and the institutional transformation, where we think that member states really need to make an effort to bring institutions into interinstitutional collaborative framework, just like the one Terry has just introduced. In Germany, for example, we have another one called the Higher Education Forum for Digitalization, which is working very, very well, and in which many, many higher education institutions and also teachers are networked in a alliance of trusted partnership in which they really open up and accept advice and guidance. So these are the three target trajectories which we have defined in our advisory group on the European level. And the recommendations which we are giving, I have already mentioned some of them, are focusing very much on the issue of improving collaboration on national level, interinstitutional level, also on European level, to initiate bench learning processes, to support an open education agenda using open educational technology for open education and open science as well, to create national and regional fora for inter-exchange of experiences, and to foster in member states on an institutional level strategic approach and on a national level as well to digital transformation, and create funding frameworks which really support teachers and incentivize student-centered learning. So that's where we are today. Building on exactly the developments which we have just heard from Michael and from Terry, and with a very, very great, really great support and participation of European member states and ministries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for setting the ground for further discussions, but also for further developments. And I'm sure that your work and recommendations of the advisory group will be taken further by the BFUG and then by the ministers of higher education in the ministerial conference of the Bologna process in Rome in November. I would like to call now Gohar to shortly present the European Student Union work on learning and teaching, and in particular student-centered learning, this new pedagogy that Paul was mentioning. And how do students see the challenges for further developments in this area, and in particular in the context of the COVID-19 outbreak and the consequences to learning and teaching? Gohar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's my pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me well. And I also hope that all of us, the speakers and the participants, have still some energy and freshness left, you know, though it's kind of getting to the late afternoon. I will try to, you know, play around a bit with my voice so people get a little bit more awakened. and I'll try to also be short. So indeed, I'm really happy to be at this meeting and speak with these colleagues with whom I had a chance already to speak a lot on learning and teaching, just because ESU is doing a lot of work on learning and teaching. And we have a policy area that is focusing on the learning and teaching. We have been part of many different projects, such as Effect Itself, that was mentioned. We are part of the learning and teaching group of the BFUG, of which we just heard the extensive presentation. We're also part of the Learning and Teaching Forum steering committee of the European University Association that is happening annually. So we try to be in many different places when learning and teaching is being discussed. And particularly, one thing that I would find relevant to mention from our activities is a recent study, like a research that me and one of my previous colleagues, who is actually Croatian, we did a research about policy of student-centered learning that was developing for quite some time, more than a few decades on the European level, and the practice of applying student-centered learning in teaching and learning in the European higher education area. And this research was really interesting one because we really highlighted in this research how much of a gap there exists between the policy discussions on student-centered learning and the practical implementation of student-centered learning. And I'm really happy that this conference that the Croatian presidency has organized had really, I think, a good focus on both of the parts, both on policy discussions and also practical application and development to the learning and teaching. So very much credits for that to you. And the challenges that we now see that exist in the area of learning and teaching and the development of learning and teaching, besides this gap that we actually need to really make sure that goes hand in hand, there are several, and COVID-19 crisis has basically very much strengthened these challenges to made it more visible and more obvious to all of us. During the COVID crisis, I think we saw that the institutions, the universities especially, or higher education institutions in the European higher education area, that would often resist to changes. We saw during the crisis that they managed to get into this mode of a change really rapidly with a real stick. So I think this showed us that we can together overcome certain challenges, which sometimes feel not really easy to go through. And the challenges that still remain with us are the ones connected to how to identify, for example, the support that students need in this new reality, how to make sure that they are not completely isolated from the changes that our universities or policymakers, decision makers are implementing, how to make sure that internationalization of learning and teaching is not suffering, because right now, and also it seems in the future semester, we will not really be able to look into the international dimension of learning and teaching as a normal one as we know it. So we need to invent these new ways of still sustaining internationalization of learning and teaching. Another challenge is how can we redefine our ideas about learning and teaching environments? Because usually when we would talk about learning and teaching environment, we will very much imagine the campus, the libraries, the student areas, which are, very motivating, etc. But in a new digital reality, how we are able to sustain this learning and teaching environments, how we are able to make sure that both our teachers and learners and the students feel connected to this environment and motivated by this environment. These are extremely challenging issues that haven't been definitely addressed in this rapid change that the universities had to make to this emergency e-learning, but these are things that we need to look into in order to really further develop learning and teaching in the European education area as we intended as a vision. And probably just a final challenge that I will mention, and then we go on into other questions, would be the challenge to redefine the rights of learners, because now students come to a completely new reality where we need to make sure that we think about their rights, we ensure that they have their rights protected and discussed, and even just made aware to them, because often students are really not aware about it. And yeah, we just need to make sure that we keep this in mind while trying to adapt to all the changes that are happening now. And I'm happy to later on go in more details on all these topics.
Thank you, Gohar. So I would like ask a question to Michael. You mentioned in your introductory speech, and also it was mentioned by Ulf, that institutions need to be supported by the governments, by the ministries in their developments, in developments of this policy area. And this in particular with the crisis caused by the coronavirus, we may see that the challenges will be higher, and there will be possible a high dropout from students, in particular from students from disadvantaged backgrounds and also from international students. And maybe there will also be challenges with lower enrollment rates in the next academic year. So what is your opinion? How could the teachers and institutions be supported better in facing these challenges that are ahead of us? We can't hear you, Michael. Can you turn on your microphone?
Can you hear me now? Yeah. I mean, very good questions. So let me start with whether we have less students, we might also end up having more students. That was also the impact of the 2008 crisis. In some countries, numbers of students went down, in others it increased. We just heard last week from our Icelandic colleague that Iceland may have more than 20% more enrollment, higher enrollment in the autumn. So that could be the other challenge. But a good question on how to improve them. I mean, what we have seen in the crisis, whoever was disadvantaged before was more disadvantaged in the crisis. And in addition, I think through the crisis, the numbers of disadvantage had actually increased. I mean, it's partly material, as we know, access to computers, to internet. It's also the whole social situation of students that may have deteriorated and an end. As Gohar said, while most institutions probably managed to get teaching online quickly, I think there is no doubt that they had little time to think about how to support students then. So we know from some institutions they have put up helplines, support lines for students, so these kind of things. But it's essentially about what also Gohar had said. If you have a campus, it's a physical environment, so the architecture does partly the work for you. You enter it, you know where to go, there's the library, there's the lecture hall, we can see each other, so that's helpful certainly for inclusion. On the other hand, we also know that it would be wrong to assume that just because few students are physically present that they learn. So I think the question is really to think about how we can translate some of the support services to online, or make them adaptable to a blended learning environment. There might be a lot of things to learn from the colleagues from the open universities who have been doing that for decades now. And they will also tell you that this is not so easy, and it takes actually quite a lot of resources. So whoever thought that putting education online is cheap and easy, that's actually now the proof that it is not. So I think that's something that institutions are currently exploring. We know that many of them do not only plan the next semester, but also they try to ensure a better student experience in the next semester. A lot of things, I think, are built on what several of us had said already before. It's about pedagogics. It's about learning and teaching, and we have to bring it to a new or different situation. And this, if you have to bring teachers and university administrators, student support services together to think that through and try things out. We also know that many institutions involve students in that already now, also for curriculum redesign and course redesign. So the students are involved as course designers, but also as co-designers, but also as testers then. So that would be my immediate reaction to it.
Thank you, Michael. And you said that it's not cheap to develop online education, good quality educational resources. It needs time and also material resources. And we often face the situation where institutions and teachers are not that much willing to share what they develop. And I would like to ask Ulf now, because it is also one of the recommendations coming from the BFEG advisory group, that a good quality digital learning and teaching material should be openly shared. And what do you think, Ulf, what are the main obstacles to implement these recommendations in this respect, and how can these be addressed?
Thank you for the question. This is really going into the heart of what we can see today. Actually, what we think is that if everybody is online, the open education model should work best, because everybody is using digital learning materials, creating them, storing them. But what we can see is that, again, availability is not the dimension which makes open education work. Technical availability is not what makes open education work. What makes open education work is really a sharing culture. It's really a culture in which we are collaborating in institutions together as teams in an alliance of teachers working for better teaching. Then open education works. If you look at all the empirical results which we have for that, it's really the sense of ownership which is important for open education as a success factor. The sense of ownership, and the question is, how can we create this sense of ownership in an institution or on a national level? And the first and the best issue, what we know today, is collaboration for that. If you have the feeling that you're collaborating with somebody, giving you a piece of content, an open educational resource, this works much better. I think what is also important is that to think about what do we want to take away. We can view this corona situation as a crisis situation, which it is. It is a health crisis situation, it's a systems crisis situation. But we can also ask the question, what is the lesson beyond corona for higher education institutions? And for sure, sharing of experiences and sharing of material, sharing of resources is one lesson. We can see the old saying is true for that as well, where sharing took place before, sharing is working better now. Where sharing did not take place, it's not working. But another issue there is also that more and more we need to understand and to discuss that online and open education is not a deficit model. What we always use, we use terms and describe the current situation with remote learning, with distance education and distance. We are not really understanding that online pedagogy can be actually something very, very rich and interactive and lead to individualized learning pathways, to personalized learning in much better ways than we can do that if there are 50 students sitting in one classroom learning all the same thing at the same time, the same intensity. So online learning is really opening new pathways for flexibility, which we should really take away beyond Corona and stop thinking that we are currently working in a deficit model, but really seeing the value of it. We just need to overcome this synchronicity reflex. I call it always the reflex of synchronous learning. Yeah? That my colleagues and me sometimes as well, but I try to not do it, but my colleagues often we are just going online and do what we do in the lecture hall, lecturing for 3 or 4 hours, and there's nothing more boring than a 3 or 4 hour long lecture if you watch it as a broadcast. And that's exactly what we need to overcome. Stop thinking about online as a deficit model, overcome the synchronous reflex, see the students' situation, involve them in a participation, in a conversation about their situation, and understand what really are the learning strategies, which work for them. Because if we are able to understand as teachers how we can support students in becoming better self-organized students and self-supported students, autonomous learners, then I think we have hit the golden bullet which we actually want to do. So that's, I think, the tasks, and that's all about open learning, actually. Yeah? Open learning is not just using resources. Open learning needs to involve students in a different way, open up learning pathways in a more flexibilized way, and online learning has this as the main value proposition if we understand it correctly.
Thank you. I would like to take one question from the audience. We have questions here related to digital education and digital resources, and it seems that it's not that difficult to have teaching of theory through digital tools, but when it comes to laboratory skills development and practical learning, it may be a little bit more challenging. Are there any thoughts on this respect? How can we deal with these challenges? Maybe Terry? Oh, okay, Gohar, please. You raised your hand if you have something to advise us.
Just a quick idea that comes to me in this case, and then I'll also be very happy to hear what Terry would say. I think the best is if for this type of learning, universities would really integrate very high technology in their teaching and learning, such as augmented reality or VR technologies, which would help students to understand the experience much better virtually, but then also organize, give options for students to visit universities sometimes in a hybrid model to also have lab experiences at the institution. I think that could be a solution.
Thank you, Gohar. When we open the question of cross-border cooperation, because we are trying to see how the national structures and the supporting systems for teachers could work cross-border, and in particular in this very difficult situation when we are limited when it comes to physical traveling. What do you see? What is the future of European higher education area and future of European cooperation in general, taking into account all these challenges? Please, Terry, if you can think of how your success in building the national structures can be maybe inspirational for enhancing the structures that we have at the European level.
Well, we're stronger and we're smarter when we work together. I think that's the most important message that we certainly at a national level have learned. And I think it's the same at a European level. Certainly the experience of working within the EFFECT project and just hearing the different happenings in different countries, different approaches, it gives you ideas, and one idea leads to more ideas. So I think that the success that we're seeing at a national level, and people will say, well, Ireland's small, yes, but we're still dealing with 34 different institutions. So there must be kind of a series of structures that we could put in place that enables us to have the conversations and identify what's common, but also gives us the freedom to contextualize it for our own environment. So in the same way that if I'm speaking to an institution, yes, we can do something at a national level, but it only has meaning if it's then that's taken and actually interpreted at an institutional level. So it's about finding those common areas, having those conversations at a European level, and then working within the individual countries to say, well, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for our institutions? And how can we move this forward in our context?
Thank you. Let's take another question from the audience. I will address this one to Michael. It's how to open mindsets of experienced tenured professors that online learning is a great paradigm shift from what they used to do for decades.
Okay, yeah. I rather prefer to answer the previous question, actually.
Okay.
No, just to add what Terry has said, I think that was absolutely right. You know, what you will find under the link that I have shared is also we looked actually at different national approaches and found out that they are very different. As the same institutions deal with it differently. So I think the only thing that you can make is make these different structures speak to each other and try to build up a community. I also shared the bit of promotion, the link for our next European Learning and Teaching Forum, which is under the title, I forgot the title, it's something about sustainability. So very, very much important these days. But I think it's really then when you see countries have developed different approaches. I think what doesn't work for sure is if you just regulate it top down, that will backfire, that will drive away those who were actually in support of it, yeah, and the other ones were anyhow not interested. So you have to engage, you have to communicate about it, you have to offer something that is useful, that is attractive, and probably also prestigious. I mean, look what attracts people in research, yeah, and what makes research so prestigious. So some of these things we should probably copy, some of these things we should also do better as in research. So don't start to rank teaching, for example. Yeah, but I think that's very important, building the teacher community, or look where they already exist, bring them together. And this is what we try to do at European level. Terry and her colleagues do that at the Irish level, and that's the point. I mean, how to convince tenure-track professors that online learning is a good thing. I wouldn't know how to do that. What I can see that the acceptance of digitally enhanced learning has grown tremendously over the past 5-6 years. I mean, I remember when we started working on that, 2012-13, there was so much, there were so many opinions about it. At the extremes, people who thought online learning will save the world, and on the other extreme, people who thought online learning will ruin universities, you know, and this has melted down. And in the middle, we have people who start to have hands-on experience with it and know what's possible and what is not possible. And the current crisis helped to enlarge the pool of those who have actually hands-on experience. I read in your survey, Terry, that 70% of the Irish academics said that they had no immediate experience with online teaching. Well, by now they have, yeah. And I think that was not only Ireland, but it was that was across Europe the situation. Yeah, the acceptance was already there, but there was no hands-on experience. And I think that's what it is. It's also not the fact that we want to convert everything and everybody to online learning. I mean, we use it at the moment as an emergency. I think Ulf is absolutely right. We should look for the ways, the approaches on how we can use it in a more strategic, more useful way. Where does it really make sense? And when I looked at the recent ESU survey last week, your colleagues shared some of the results, Gohar. I was a bit surprised to see how much students emphasized face-to-face, exactly what Ulf just said, which might not make sense to have everything synchronous and face-to-face. So educationalists would tell you this doesn't make sense, but you can see both students and teachers actually still hold to it. So we need experience. I think we have to look at different models. We have to experiment and try out what are useful ways of organizing our learning and teaching. Also, when the pandemic is gone, in a more sensible, in a more clever and smarter way.
Yes, I think it is an important point to make that not only teachers need to make this change of paradigm, but also students, because they are not anymore, I mean, they are required to be even more active, and they are becoming co-creators of the teaching and learning process. And as Gohar said at the beginning, the students need support in order to be able to exercise this new role. What can we do to support them? Are there some ideas that can be shared how to support students to deal with the challenges in this respect? Ulf, can you please share your views on that, since you emphasized the digitalization component at the beginning? Maybe you can also address the question on challenges that address that are in relation to the students and their role.
I can try that. I mean, students are really the center of the study process, and this has to become clear. But also we have to be clear that students are learners, and learning is also a socialization process. We are taking students into our institutions, and we are working with them, and we are proposing things to them, and we are discussing values and interaction processes with them. And so it is important, if we want to draw on students' preferences, value students' diversity, want to be inclusive and really development oriented, and not just knowledge and oriented in the dump down model, then we really have to engage them into a conversation in an open learning process. The model which we have in our institutions, and it hurts me to say that because I am also an institutional actor, in which we are presenting students with a fixed and ready-made curriculum when they enter this university, and that they know already from day one on which assignments and exams they are writing. A bachelor in Germany has 25 to 28 modules. Each module has one module assessment exam. That means there are 25 to 28 exams in between, and you can already know when they are and what you have to learn from the day one on. So, and we have to start to break up this kind of model of the upfront preparation to an inquiry, to a conversation-oriented model in which we are really trying to bring in students, and that's a game changer. I can tell you that's a game changer. That's a big challenge, and we need all this kind of collaboration, encouragement, and alliances on an institutional and interinstitutional level, which we talked about. But I think there is no way around it. What we have done, by the way, just last point, we have started a podcast series. It's called Study in Shutdown. And we have started a podcast series to interview students. How is your situation suddenly studying at home? What are your strategies of studying? How do you keep focused on your study? What do you expect from your university? What works, what doesn't work? What are your tips and tricks for your other fellow students? And this podcast series that was so popular, suddenly we had thousands and thousands of people listening to it, and we were on TV and on television. So there's a very rich interest around this story, and we're going to continue this podcast series now with the support of ESO ESU, the European Students' Union, thanks Gohar again, on a European level again. So it's possible. Students know that they want to be a partner and they need to be involved, but we need to be open as institutions. And it's not an easy process. We have to do things differently.
Thank you, Ulf. I will take this one as maybe the main message that you kept for the end. And I would like, since we are running out of time, I would like to ask other panelists as well to choose one most important message for them and to voice it now so that the participants may take it from this conference. So Michael, Terry, and then Gohar. One sentence, please. Michael, turn on your microphone. Can't hear you.
I think I don't have the most important message. Probably what Ulf just said is very important. You know, that it's all about also meaningful conversation and sometimes also facing some unpopular truth within your institution or your environment. So what we have seen is that many institutions actually ran surveys, reviews to students, to staff, and asked about feedback, and they are discussing the results. And I think the good thing was that it showed actually that also this emergency remote teaching was actually not so bad. Many students and staff actually said that they learned a lot through it. So let's face it. I mean, talk to each other, engage with each other, and try to improve it together. I think what I heard from some colleagues is that they are talking about the future, that they are actually more worried about going back to normal than that they're worried that going back could be going back to the old normal and not to a new normal, whereas it is felt really that this was such a period of time. Andreas Schleicher also said it this morning, you know, he said it was 20 years advanced basically in terms of innovation in education. I don't know if that was the same for higher education, but I think we leapfrogged some years, but there is a risk that we just go back and continue as it was before. That would be my concern. So try to keep on and try to ensure that the good things stay on and that we develop further.
Yes. Thank you, Michael. Terry, can you think of the most important thing for this conference?
Absolutely. Keep people rather than technology at the core of what you're doing. Focus on collaboration, belonging, staff and student well-being as we're planning for the next semester.
Thank you, Terry. And Gohar, the students for the end.
Yes, I can definitely agree with all the messages that have been already said. So it's already three other sentences. And then mine would be, just don't let the crisis to be used as an excuse for exclusion, whether that's exclusion from access to quality digital learning, from having digital tools to access the digital learning, or whether that will be just excluding students from decision making, for example, because we have also seen this happen. So yeah, don't use it as an excuse, but use it as an opportunity to improve things.
Thank you, Gohar, and thank you very much to all the panelists and to the audience for sending us their questions. And we will take now a short break.